r/AskReddit. What's the most you've seen someone change from high school to your class reunion? I can do worse than this time frame. So when I was in high school I knew a guy named Quincy. In high school Quincy was a really good student. He was in the orchestra program on piano. He was a tech kid. His goal in high school was to work for Google as an adult. That's what he wanted to do. Quincy is the only person I've ever met who truly used marijuana as a gateway drug. He tried it for the first time after high school. I think the problem was that his family was very strict, and so it just blew his mind that weed was even a thing. Both of his parents were teachers at the university in my town. He had essentially a full free ride to college. But he branched out too much from weed. It started with weed, then it went to hallucinogens. He did those for a while and you could see that he had a problem with moderation, essentially tripping his balls off all the time. One time I stood behind a Christmas tree and had a full argument with him, and he thought I was the angel on the top of the tree. He actually got mad at a tree decoration. It was pretty funny, but then he started to devolve into lesser drugs. He picked up nitrous oxide. He did that a lot, and while I enjoy the occasional nitro I could never attempt to keep up with the amount he did. Then he went from that to rubber tripping, drinking cough syrup for fun, which to me sounds gross. These were the worst times that I saw. He would sit in a chair looking like he was going to throw up on himself for hours and days. After I stopped hanging out with him, Quincy got hard into pills. At one point he was so fucked up that he beat up a foreign exchange student that was his roommate because he thought the dude was breaking into his house. When the police arrested him, he was literally making the pew noise with finger guns at them while cradled beside his bed. He spent 4 months in the mental hospital in our town after this. From that point on Quincy would spend his time between homelessness and jail. He got an inheritance from his grandmother when she died and spent every penny of it on drugs. During this entire process his parents absolutely turned their back on him. I can't blame them, but they didn't help. 2 years ago Quincy overdosed on painkillers and died. It was the second most depressing funeral I've been to. In the span of 4 years he went from dreaming of being a Google employee to being a dead drug addict. He is the example I use when I preach moderation. I'm not against drug use. I love drugs personally. I think DMT and MDMA are great drugs. But you have to understand the limitations. It's not hard to be smart with drugs. I've done heroin and I didn't get addicted. I did 2 hits of heroin in a day, felt questionable and decided I needed to not do it for 2 years. That's my limit. In about 8 months I'll be comfortable enough to do heroin for fun for a day again. Moderation is a learned habit. Quincy didn't have that habit, and it killed him. It's just crazy to me that a guy I once admired for intelligence turned into some who I hated for his life choices. It was such a shame when he died. Not someone else, but this is my story. I grew up in foster homes and orphanages in Orange County, California. During elementary school I went to multiple schools. In 4th grade that school year I went to 4 different schools. They finally did a basic knowledge test and realized I couldn't read well or do basic math. I tested at a 1st grade reading level and 2nd grade math level. I still remember that feeling of not having a real family and learning on my own. I was a ward of the state of California for 8 years. During those 8 years I was assaulted by foster families, homeless on the streets, lived in churches and abandoned homes. I frequently would have to eat ramen uncooked and sprinkle the seasonings on top of the raw ramen. I was granted custody to my aunt, who then decided that she didn't want kids and literally gave me to someone. The person she gave me to had kids as well, so she thought it would be a good environment. But I was beaten and assaulted on a daily basis. I didn't know who I could tell or how I could get out of the situation. I finally ran away and was homeless for a while until a church I went to called Human Services. My mother was granted custody of me when I was beginning high school. She initially lost custody of me due to being in prison for selling narcotics. After the initial monthly reviews from Human Services stopped, she and her boyfriend began selling drugs. After a few months I noticed kids from my high school and local college stopping by my house to hang out with me. I then became popular in school and everyone wanted to come and hang out at my house. In school I was known as the go-to guy to get stuff from, even though I have never done drugs or even partook in selling drugs. One day I had some friends over and we were watching Troy. What a great movie, and my front door is getting kicked in. I stand up and turn around to face a shotgun being held by the local police. Needless to say, my life was still in pieces. My mother's boyfriend took the fall, so she was still able to somehow maintain custody of me. As stated earlier, I never received the proper guidance I needed for education. I was barely passing my classes with all C's and didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I knew how I want going to live my life and knew that if I had a family I wouldn't want to out them through this. After high school I tried to learn as much as I could about anything I could. I also worked on memorization techniques so that I could excel at whatever I chose to pursue. I enrolled at a local university and graduated with a BS in Business and Operations Management with a 3.2 GPA. I still had to take remedial classes in college because I never took them in high school and didn't score high enough to test out in university. I then continued into a MBA program where I graduated with honors. I have worked as a business consultant for a few Fortune 100 companies. Presently I'm managing a team at a Fortune 50 company and couldn't be happier. I have been happily married for 5 years and we have 2 kids that will never have to go through what I did as a child. I'm sure those people I went to high school with thought I wouldn't amount to much, but little did they know I utilize those experiences as fuel to drive my success. Honestly, myself. When I went to school I was the quiet girl who was kind of friendly, but also a little scary. I had a really rough home situation involving every kind of abuse there is. I constantly wore long skirts and pants with long sleeves even in hot weather and covered myself as much as possible because I didn't want anyone to see the bruises, rug burns, scraped and sometimes even cuts that covered my body from what happened to me at home on a regular basis. I didn't really wear makeup and was terrified of closeness with anyone including other girls. I'm a bisexual girl myself, though at the time I hated myself for it and wouldn't admit to it because I was terrified that someone would force themselves on me because I thought that happened a lot and I couldn't take it anymore. Violence was pretty normalized for me, so I would often threaten people who tried to mess with me. I won't go into detail, but it usually involved gun/knife/torture. I'm physically quite small and petite, but I had a really demented imagination and an immersive enough way with words to make anyone at least a little fearful, enough to make them leave me alone anyways. I was genuinely a dangerous person and was extremely unstable, but I was kind of binary. Anyone I didn't hate enough to want to hurt I was either scared of or just shy around, so I was very meek and quiet most of the time. 2 or 3 different guys over my high school years realized this and took advantage of me in one way or another. I moved around at least once per year, so there was no shortage of new people at each new school, which made my mental state dramatically worse. Eventually my mom got me on a program to go to a college for most of my classes since my grades were impeccable, so I gradually faded from 1 or 2 college classes to an almost full college campus schedule by the time I graduated. In those classes no one gave a shit about me or talked to me, so I started to recover some emotionally. I eventually got away from the worst of my abusers at home, so I started expanding my wardrobe and wearing clothes that made me feel pretty. I started experimenting with makeup for things other than hiding busted lips and bruised eyes, and started to actually like myself some, physically. I met a few really important people, including a girl who I never got to date, but the mutual crush between the 2 of us and her openness and liberal mindset helped me reconcile my sexuality a bit. Eventually I got into therapy, got on some medication, found a boyfriend who didn't yell at me or hit me, and who never once made me feel bad for flinching when he held a hand up or having panic attacks once in a while that interrupt sex. He had been a huge part of my recovery, and I got an emotional support dog. So now I wear dresses and blouses and colorful clothes to school almost every day. I make friends and talk to people a lot in my classes, and I'm currently working through a lot of the self-destructive tendencies I've built up over the years, like self-harm or self-sabotaging. I'm pretty normal now, aside from the few scars I still have of my old life, though I don't have many. For some reason I almost never scar from anything, even when I've had injuries, so had I needed medical attention. I get minor scars, but they fade within a year almost always. It's also been years since I've made a super serious suicide attempt. It used to be somewhat regular, aside from times where I get close to doing something bad, but back out at the last minute, which still happens a lot. It's difficult to convince a brain that suicide is a bad option when it latches onto the idea that there is just a button which would make all of the pain and memories go away. I still suffer from pretty bad depression and lots of PTSD-like symptoms, among a few other things. But on the outside I'm an entirely different person, and I can't even imagine what it was like to be who I used to be. I don't know, maybe not exactly what Op intended, but I figured it might be an interesting addition. The girl I was in love with was a French transplant to a small southern town. Her father was a Baptist preacher who couldn't find a church to work in, and her mom was mental. She was stunning, spoke 6 languages, was as smart as she was hilarious. She was kind too, very patient with people who weren't as smart as her. She never held herself above them, and was liked by many others as well. She was mostly quiet, walked to school, and almost never attended any after-school function. We spent our time together at the only coffee shop in town, getting to know each other over our senior year. Our last night together was a group camping trip out to a rice field with a giant river in the middle of it. Her and I went for a walk in the field and talked about our upcoming separation, different colleges and whatever else until a huge storm came out of nowhere. We ran for cover towards an abandoned 1920s bread truck. Someone had left the couch in it, so we cuddled up and watched the rain and the river churn past us in the dark as it climbed up and over its banks. One guy, legitimate child prodigy / genius type, in a super competitive STEM program. As in, most of us are in 11th grade doing calculus and he's about 12, having skipped a grade or 2, and then is sitting in on a higher grade just for math class. His parents had a professor from a major university tutoring him after school, pushing him to do math competitions, the whole 9 yards. I don't think he got much of a say in it. It was what they'd been having him do since the age of 3 or so. His senior year, he'd had enough. He dropped out of the STEM magnet program and switched to the creative and performing arts magnet program. His physique was very much a computer programmer's more than a dancer, and he had zero experience with song and dance. He graduates, goes to a small private West Coast school instead of Harvard/Yale like his parents had planned, majors in musical theater. After a year or 2, that changes to journalism. Takes a leave of absence from school 2 years in to convert to Mormonism. Did I mention his parents were hardcore atheists? Even though Mormons don't make converts do mission trips, he did a mission trip to India for longer than the usual mission. The last I'd heard from him, he was married and having lots of LDS kids somewhere on the West Coast. He's a fantastic guy, but if you'd asked me in 11th grade where I thought he'd end up, it would not have been anywhere close to failed musical theater major and Mormon missionary. I went to school with a guy from a very wealthy family, as in, his parents once bought 2 $10 million houses next to one another, just so they could knock them down and build a much larger house across the 2 blocks. This guy was more or less the epitome of never has to work a day in his life. Average grades in average classes, not particularly into sports, not at all nerdy, but not a jock. Just a guy who hung out with all the right people, threw some epic parties, but was not really outstanding in any way other than he was loaded. He was a nice guy most of the time, with no particular inclination to anything, and no indication of what would come. If anything, everything about him at school screamed the opposite of what happened. He and I shared a few classes together over an 8-year period, and I saw nothing which would indicate he was destined for anything but a standard rich kid life. He kind of dropped off the face of the earth after school and rocked up to our 10-year reunion looking completely different. He was taller and much bigger, as in stronger, built like a brick shithouse, and really fit. It turns out that he had left high school and earned a degree in strategic studies while training to be an officer in the SAS. He was in the army, in the SAS, for 8 years and received some pretty serious decorations before leaving to head back to school and start a business. He now has a few master's degrees in a few different fields, everything from computer science to history. Nearly 10 years on from that, and he sold the cybersecurity firm he founded post-SAS for tens of millions of dollars, and has returned to government service as a senior diplomat and foreign policy advisor, all without touching a cent of his parents' millions. I would never have picked it. I'd have assumed his path would be something like a boring commerce/law degree and a career in the family business conglomerate, which he'd eventually take over. Fast cars and loose women. I mean, there's still hope for him yet. Kid who was popular and a solid dude. Dad bought him a really expensive sports car in high school. Wasn't really rich exactly, but dad thought this was important, I guess. Showed up at 10-year reunion smelling like shit and drunk off of his ass. Had done nothing, but eventually in his early 20s gone into the military, but had basically gotten shin splints, and been in VA 4 years and done nothing. I think he bounced out. His breath was horrible. Everyone was trying to get away from him. He had a relatively nice, if also drunk-ish, girl with him. At one point in the night the girlfriend followed my girlfriend into the single-person bathroom. She proceeded to ask to see my girlfriend's boobs. They were fake. And then before my girlfriend could react, she threw up everywhere. My girlfriend got her cleaned up, while she cried about how awful he was to her, and how she needed to get boobs. My girlfriend finally came out looking distraught, and asked me to help find this girl's boyfriend. We brought her over to him, and he was talking to a group of people who were, more or less, just kind of listening, but gossiping about him at the same time. His girlfriend went off, crying. He was telling her to stop. She pointed at my girlfriend and said something like, "Is this what you need me to be? Do I need big fake tits like all the girls you sit around masturbating to all day long? I can get ones just like hers. You'd probably still masturbate to other girls." The place was stunned. She ran off. He kind of laughed at her. My girlfriend was mortified. Lovely night. Later I saw him drive off in that car, which was falling apart. From day 1 of 6th grade to the final day of my senior year in high school there was a guy with whom I was constantly rivaling. I was new to town in 6th grade and my first real friend just so happened to be his GF. So naturally, he wanted to fight me, lol. We never fought, but there were many tense crossings. We both played basketball and our cliques would battle constantly. Also, anytime we passed in the halls, or in the lunchroom or during PE, nonsensical testosterone-filled bickering took place. Fast forward to 2 years after high school graduation. I'm sitting at a bar in downtown Minneapolis having a drink, while my buddies were off dancing. All of a sudden a guy sits down next to me and says, "Give me a tall MGD, and one more of these." He points to my CPT Coke. For my good buddy. After the very first word he spoke I knew his voice, and I never looked up, wondering who the hell he thought he was calling me his buddy. Insert South Park joke, "I'm not your buddy, guy, lol." Rather, I sat still, and kept my gaze fixed on its previous position. The only change in my demeanor was that I was now clenching my fists as tightly as I could, white knuckles showing. After a few seconds he spoke to me. "Hey man, here's a drink. I offer it to you with an apology. I still haven't looked up. I just wanna say sorry. Damn, high school was such bullshit." Now he's piqued my interest, so I look up. He looked exactly as I remembered him, except minus the scowl. As I glanced up I nodded in agreement and finally I said, "Yeah, high school sure was bullshit, wasn't it?" He laughed and we started talking. I ended up chatting with him for about 20 to 30 minutes. Turns out we had a lot in common, including our choice of college and favorite drinking spots. For the first time I saw him as a person, not a giant douche, and since I had already figured out about 5 minutes after high school graduation that everything about interpersonal relationships in high school was complete hogwash, I realized so was our feud. Surprisingly, that was it. 15 years later, almost, and I haven't ever seen him again. But that was by far the most radical change I ever saw in one human. Not only in how they act or acted, but also the way I act, or acted around them. Every once in a while his name comes up, and I always tell everyone that we were cool, we'd buried that proverbial hatchet. I hope that anyone who is reading this, and might be having a similar school feud, will listen to these words. Absolutely none of that high school drama will matter after you get out there. As soon as you finish school, you finish having a constant need to impress random people for social status purposes. Don't believe me? Well, what if I could tell you your future? Here goes. On day 1 of college, you'll wear track pants and a hoodie to class LMAO. It's really that simple. All the bullshit just ends after high school. A whole next level of maturity will come from going to college. TL. Doctor, bumped into high school for a few years after graduating, and you'd ended up apologizing to me, and was actually a cool guy. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe the channel.